As we continue our discussion of the economic revolutions of the 19th century and the massive labor upheaval, we should also understand that the political parties in the 19th century really failed to address the desperate needs of working people, and as a result, many people turned to new ideologies. Some might argue radical ideologies, in particular, the ideologies of socialism and communism, primarily because it appeared, at least on the surface, that these new political and socioeconomic ideologies promised more economic and social equality for the working classes. If you take a look at this image here, you'll note um, a clear criticism of capitalism. And this is an image produced to be very critical of some of America's most powerful capitalists and industrialists, people like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, and some of these other individuals. If you'll take a look here, you'll note that underneath this barge or raft, you have the laborers, the hardworking average people. You'll note on the waves there it says hard times, and that's what they are enduring. It's got a listing of some of the average wages of these individuals per week. They're making very little money, a paltry sum. They're working very long hours. It's extremely challenging for them. And it's this idea that you have these corporate fat cats, these very powerful industrialists and capitalists who are sitting on their bags of money, supported by the millions of hardworking laborers, people in the lower classes who produce all of the wealth, all of the prosperity, but derive none of the benefits, while capitalists, that is, the people that own the means of production, corporation owners, entrepreneurs, industrialists, capitalists, sit high and mighty on the backs of these individuals. And so this is an image obviously produced to be very critical of capitalism. Another critic of capitalism was Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German political thinker and philosopher in the 19th century. He did most of his work in England. He published the Communist Manifesto in 1848 with another socialist thinker by the name of Friedrich Engels, a British philosopher. Marx also wrote the multi-volume Das Kapital in 1867. These were his criticisms of capitalism, and he had some good reasons for being critical of capitalism. That is Karl Marx. Let's go back to Marx for just a moment. He lived much of his life in industrial Germany, Prussia, and England, and throughout his lifetime, he saw the exploitation that was the result of capitalism. He saw the masses, the workers struggling in abject poverty and being unable to make ends meet or provide for their families or provide a better way of life for their children. And so he came to believe that capitalism was a very exploitive form of business, and he spent most of his life critiquing capitalism, and he was quite articulate in how he did it, and gained a multitude of adherents as a result of his writings. He argued that capitalism was evil, that it destroyed important human values, and it replaced really all belief systems with that of simply naked exploitation of the workers. He argued that capitalism undermined an individual's sense of personal value in one's work, that people couldn't be proud of their work. So it was this idea that, prior to the Industrial Revolution, the average person, let's say a cobbler, a person who made a pair of shoes, it was this idea that people were skilled laborers. People had a set of skills. They were artisans. If you needed a pair of shoes, you went to a cobbler, and he measured your foot and made you a pair of shoes from start to finish, from scratch, and you paid a good price for a good pair of shoes. But with capitalism and with a shift towards a factory economy, no one made a pair of shoes. Instead, people worked on an assembly line where each person had a very specific but also very monotonous and mind-numbing task on that assembly line, where one person attached the heel of the shoe, the next person maybe glued the sole or insole of the shoe. And so no one knew how to make a pair of shoes anymore. No one was a skilled laborer. It devalued labor and one's sense of personal work ethic. He argued that capitalism undermined human relationships because all relationships were based on profit and, by extension, based on greed. He argued that capitalism destroyed human freedom and that the only freedom it protected was that of free trade, capitalism. And so he argued that there was a coming war between the bourgeoisie urban middle class and the urban labor class, or the proletariat. That is, this word proletariat literally means the landless class. And so Karl Marx argued that modern capitalists who owned the means of production therefore owned the profits and dominated the societies of Europe in the late 19th century. Today, the bourgeoisie would include major stockholders and corporations, the so-called 1%. There's a lot of talk today about the 1%, this uber elite class of people who control the majority of wealth in the world, whether it be in the United States or in Europe. This is not new. Karl Marx argued that there was a coming class war between the bourgeoisie, urban middle class, and the urban labor class, or proletariat. Modern wage laborers who sold their labor to live but received little, if any, of the profits, even though they generated most of the wealth through their hard work. And this included anyone who was not a stockholder, not an owner of capital, not an investor, and even professionals who worked for a salary. The 99% we would call this group today, if we were to kind of parallel this in today's terms. Karl Marx argued that there was a coming socialist or communist revolution. Socialism was an ideology propagated through the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, hence Marxism. And so socialism and Marxism are these interchangeable concepts that we'll talk about, and communism is kind of the practical application of socialism or Marxism after a socialist revolution has taken place. I'll explain all of this. Socialism is based on the assumption that capitalism is by its very nature an exploitive system that allows the most powerful in a society to prosper at the expense of the lower classes, or the masses. Karl Marx spent a lot of time in England, where industrialism had caused dramatic changes and hardship for the lower classes, the proletariat. He noted how the wealthiest members of the bourgeoisie business class, or urban merchant class, and aristocracy dominated the race for wealth. They owned the land, they owned the farms, they owned the factories. They grew wealthy while millions of impoverished Britons struggled just to put a roof over their heads and feed their kids. Karl Marx felt that this was unjust. This was his experience, his reality. And his experience was that capitalism bred greed, avarice, and allowed for the exploitation of the landless working class, or the proletariat. Marx argued that because capitalist societies were so exploitive by their very nature, that eventually the oppressed proletariat, that is, the labor class, would revolt against their capitalist masters and those who owned the means of production. Now, according to Karl Marx, this kind of class warfare or class struggle was unavoidable in a capitalist system. This is what his Communist Manifesto argued. Karl Marx warned that these socialist revolutions would occur anywhere that capitalism produced wealth for the few while the majority suffered. And Karl Marx's vision for a socialist utopia was that in a socialist system, the proletariat, or the laborers, would be the most valued. In the aftermath of socialist revolutions, which would inevitably occur in his view, the workers would take over the means of production. So it was this idea that in a socialist revolution, the urban lower classes, the labor classes, the proletariat would rise up. They would overthrow their capitalist masters. And in the aftermath of that revolution, the workers would own the means of production, meaning they would own the factories, the power companies. They would own the distribution of water and irrigation. They would own the utilities. They would take over the means of production. And once they did, the proletariat, the lower classes, the laborers, would become the government, and the government would in turn own the means of production. So it was this idea of a revolution of the lower classes, a revolution of the laborers, of the workers. And it was, in a sense, very democratic, because the idea was that the benefits of a country's resources and workforce would no longer be in the hands of capitalists, no longer be in the hands of elites, and therefore the benefit of a country's resources would be redistributed and given back to the workers, directly to the people. This was the ideal in a socialist utopia after a socialist revolution had occurred. This was the ideal, not the reality. And so Marx believed in a communist revolution. Violent revolution was, in his view, always inevitable because the bourgeoisie, that is, the powerful, the urban middle class, would always fight to preserve what they had. So Marx essentially grouped both the dominant classes, the landed aristocracy, the capitalists, the industrialists, and the urban middle class or bourgeoisie together, called all of these people the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie became a pejorative term to refer to anyone that was in a position of power, anyone that controlled the means of production, any capitalist, any industrialist. Now, communism, in the view of Marxism, takes socialism a step further. Communism is the practical application of socialism after a capitalist society has been taken over by the workers. In a communist system, we have the elimination of private property. We have the fair distribution of goods and resources, and this includes wages to a degree. Again, I am giving you Marx's ideal for a communist society. So again, just to reiterate here, because this is very important, communism is the practical application of socialism after a capitalist society has been taken over by the workers. So it's this idea that after socialism takes hold in a government, in a country, there's going to be radical reconstitution of how that nation works. And so you'll see the elimination of private property in a communist state. You'll see fair distribution of goods and resources, and to a degree it includes wages. Goods and resources will be owned in common, ideally. The state will control the means of production and distribution. So again, it's this idea that the workers take over the means of distribution. They therefore become the government, but you still have to put somebody in control. You still have to put someone in power. But in theory, the state, which is the people, would control the means of production and distribution. This was the ideal in socialism or communism. And a dictatorship of the proletariat would lead to a more equal society. This was Marx's ideal. So let's compare socialism and communism, because there are some similarities and some differences. In socialism and communism, they both see capitalism as exploitive, as leading to social injustice and to extreme income inequality. Both socialism and communism ask the question, why should those who provide the money, that is the capital, receive all of the profits, while those who provide the labor and who produce wealth receive very little or none of the profits? Those are the similarities, but there are also some differences between socialism and communism. In socialism, not all private property is abolished, but the public should control the use of property and make necessities available to all. So it's this idea that the state will control power and electricity, heat, water, and some of the most valuable resources within a country. But they will not control all private industry. So in socialism, some private industry and capitalism is still allowed to continue as long as it is not destructive to the public good. Another difference was that individual rights were not abolished under socialism, but should complement other important values, such as a concern for others. So socialism was not as authoritarian and not as all-encompassing as socialism. Now, in socialism, they believed that change could occur through a kind of evolutionary process that used democratic means. Those were some of the differences between socialism and communism. But again, when socialism did lead to revolution, inevitably there would be this communist state created. And, in theory, socialism and communism seemed egalitarian, even kind of democratic. So, it's this idea that everyone earns the same amount of money, everyone gets the same opportunities, no one's very rich or very poor, and the state's resources are redistributed for the benefit of everyone. That is the ideal. However, as the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans and the Cubanos embraced socialism and communism, their societies were anything but utopian. As it turns out, when put into practice, socialism did not work because, as it turns out, human beings are inherently self-interested. And in every state mentioned above, when people were placed in positions of power, those leaders in those countries turned out to be autocrats, heavy-handed authoritarian dictators who used their state's resources to militarize and to make their regimes powerful, but they did very little to improve the living standards of the average people or of the workers. So socialism and communism on paper seem to be these noble systems that are more democratic, more egalitarian, but in fact they are idealistic. I would argue even naive socioeconomic and political systems that simply did not produce the results that Marx intended. Nevertheless, socialism and communism were embraced by millions of human beings worldwide, especially in areas where capitalism had done very little to improve the living standards of the masses. So socialism and communism had a certain magnetism, a certain attraction to them, particularly for the lower classes, for the workers, for average people. And there were millions of these people in Europe and the United States who really found some intrinsic value in socialism and communism. But the fact was, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were quick to ignore the benefits of capitalism. They disregarded some of the inherent benefits that capitalists had been providing to the lower classes. So they're really quick to criticize the bourgeoisie, urban middle class, capitalists, the dominant class, industrialists, and the economy that these people had created and fueled without recognizing the incredible benefits that were also the product of middle class investments. Improved infrastructure, roads, canals, railroads, steamboats, easier travel, an opportunity to do something other than being a subsistence farmer or a peasant, and international commodities and cheaper foods that the lower classes could afford. Capitalism brought a lot of benefits, and these benefits were simply ignored by Marx and by other socialists. Now, socialism caught on around the world, including right here in the United States. Many labor unions right here in the United States and in Europe were formed using socialism and communism as their guiding principles. In the United States, labor revolts and radicalism were often the result of socialist factions within those labor factions or labor unions agitating for change. Numerous countries established socialist and communist political parties, legitimate political parties, including right here in the United States. If you take a look at this image, you'll see on the left, Eugene V. Debs ran for the presidency of the United States on several occasions, though the Socialist Political Party was never a really legitimate political threat in the United States, although I will tell you that during the Great Depression, socialism and communism gained a lot of adherents here in the United States. Never became a majority political party, but during the Great Depression in particular, as so many people were struggling, it appeared that capitalism had been a great failure, and many people saw value in socialism and communism. There are reasons why socialism and communism became very powerful socioeconomic and political ideologies all around the world, in Latin America, in the African continent, in Europe, and even here in the U.S.